On the day of police officer Jack Wilson's funeral, while mourners were mourning their comrade, the barking of a police dog, Cooper revealed a horrifying truth that shocked everyone when the coffin lid was opened. Cooper had been Jack's partner on the police force, and since losing his handler, he had become almost unrecognizable, weighed down by grief. Their bond hadn't come easily, but over the years, they'd grown inseparable. Now, Cooper lay on the wet ground near Jack's casket, his eyes fixated and spirit somber. As Jack's family, whom he hadn't seen in nearly 5 years, gathered beside the casket with hearts heavy with loss, the quiet only amplified the weight of their grief. The silence was punctuated by quiet sobs from Jack's relatives, and then, without warning, Cooper stood, sniffing the edges of the casket, his sorrowful whimpers carrying through the rain. The officer who had brought Cooper held his leash tightly, watching the dog. "Cooper," he murmured, his voice gentle but firm. "Come on, boy. We have to say goodbye." But Cooper wouldn't move. He stood by the casket, his paws pressed into the ground as if glued there, his soft whines turning into sharp, forceful barks that startled everyone. "Cooper, come here!" The officer tried again, but Cooper pulled harder on the leash, his barks echoing in the otherwise still cemetery. A few family members looked on in surprise, and Jack's younger sister, Sarah, wiped her tears and turned to one of the officers. Does he know?" she asked softly, her voice trembling. The officer nodded solemnly. "Dogs like Cooper form strong bonds with their partners." He knew Jack was his family. Just then, another officer knelt beside Sarah and placed a hand on her shoulder. "Cooper's been through a lot. He lost his last handler too," he explained quietly. The life of a person in a coffin is inherently beautiful. Jack had joined the Boston police force in 2012, quickly aiming to qualify for the K9 unit, a childhood dream inspired by the loyalty of his family dog. Jack was introduced to Cooper, a veteran K9 who had recently lost his previous handler in a tragic incident. Typically, dogs like Cooper would be retired or adopted out to live a quieter life, but Cooper had resisted every handler they tried to pair him with, keeping his distance. When Jack was assigned to him, everyone at the station had warned him, "Cooper won't be easy to win over." On their first day together, Jack arrived at the station parking lot prepared, bringing a treat and a soft bed for Cooper in the trunk of his patrol car. When the handler brought Cooper over, Jack extended his hand as trained. Cooper sniffed, barking once before finally allowing himself to be led. Alone in the nearly empty lot, Jack gave a quiet whistle and patted the seat beside him. Cooper hesitated, then leaped onto the passenger seat, ignoring the bed Jack had set up in the back. "All right, buddy," Jack said with a soft chuckle, patting the dashboard. "Guess you like the front seat, huh?" Cooper looked at him, and for a split second there was a glimmer of trust in the dog's eyes. Over the months, the two grew closer, and Cooper's guarded nature softened, replaced by a bond that needed no words. Jack often joked with his fellow officers that Cooper had finally decided I'm good enough for him. Jack Wilson hoped that in time, Cooper would begin to trust him as much as he had trusted his previous handler. "Hey, buddy, just give me a chance, all right?" Jack murmured, scratching Cooper's head, though he felt the dog's distance. That first week felt like a blur. In a small Texas town like this, major incidents were rare, so most of their calls were routine, and the two worked well together. Even though Cooper obeyed commands and ate the food Jack offered, there was a lingering sadness in Jack's heart. Cooper still hadn't formed a bond with him. After each shift, the dog returned to his kennel at the station rather than going home with Jack. "Why won't you let him come home with you?" one of the other officers asked, noticing Jack's discouragement. "It's not up to me," Jack replied with a sigh. "Cooper just doesn't seem interested." Determined to create a welcoming environment, Jack had transformed his apartment into the perfect home. He'd moved here after college and lived alone since his family was back in his home state. His small bachelor's apartment had a cozy blanket and bed in one corner, along with a few toys and treats still in their packages, waiting for Cooper. But as time passed, nothing changed. It seemed the dog would never be ready to come home with him. Then, about 2 months later, a call came in about a missing girl named Sarah, who'd gone hiking and hadn't returned. Rescue teams had been unsuccessful, and her phone calls went unanswered. Jack and Cooper were called in for the search. Known as the best in the search and rescue unit, Cooper was everyone's hope. "Come on, Cooper, let's bring her back," Jack said, patting the dog's head before heading out. When they arrived, the rescue team handed them a piece of Sarah's clothing provided by her worried parents. Cooper sniffed it, then surveyed the area, his gaze intense. Without a second's delay, he barked and sprinted in the opposite direction, leading them away from the main trail. The rescue team and officers exchanged looks, confused. But Jack trusted his partner's instincts and followed. Soon, Cooper disappeared from sight, the sounds of his barks echoing down the trail. "Keep up," Jack called over his shoulder to the rescue team, breaking into a jog. After a few minutes, they caught up with Cooper, who stood at the edge of a ravine where the recent storms had caused a landslide. Halfway down the slope lay Sarah, barely conscious and clinging to a broken tree root. "Good boy, Cooper," Jack called, relief flooding his voice as he steadied himself to approach the girl. "Careful," a rescuer warned as Jack moved toward her, the earth still loose from the landslide. "Stay calm, Sarah," Jack said softly. "We're here to help." He reached out, but as he did, the ground beneath him began to crumble. Cooper whimpered, trying to steady himself, his paws slipping on the unstable earth. Jack reacted quickly, grabbing his collar to pull him back. "You stay here, partner," he murmured, keeping Cooper safely by his side as the rescue team retrieved Sarah. Later, back at the station, Jack ruffled Cooper's fur, smiling. "We did it, buddy. You brought her home." Both were okay, and the rescued girl was immensely grateful. As their shift came to an end, Jack opened the car door, unable to hold back tears. For the first time in 2 months, Cooper hopped onto the blanket in the back seat, wagging his tail as Jack stroked his head. It looked as though Jack Wilson had finally gained his new partner's trust. That night, for the first time since losing his previous handler, Cooper went home with Jack instead of spending the night in the kennel on the police grounds. Over the following year, Cooper and Jack grew closer, and after 15 months working side by side, they seemed inseparable. Every other officer who hadn't been able to form that partnership with the dog was genuinely happy for their unique bond. Everything seemed perfect until a late July evening in 2013. For the past several months, the city had faced a string of burglaries, with thieves targeting warehouses that had only minimal security. At first, the group would simply steal merchandise, but one night, a guard was found shot right outside one of the warehouses. After that, the police elevated the case, marking the burglars as dangerous criminals, making their capture the precinct's highest priority. This led Jack and Cooper to team up with another officer named Chris, a new recruit who had joined the station only a few months earlier. Due to the staff shortage, the department allowed Chris to assist with the warehouse investigation, provided he was accompanied by a more experienced officer. That night, they were assigned to patrol a new warehouse that had recently opened on the outskirts of town. Over recent weeks, the burglars had become increasingly brazen, and due to limited funds, the warehouse owners had skipped hiring security and installing cameras. However, the facility stored valuable goods, making it an enticing target for the gang. So the department decided that Jack, Chris, and Cooper would wait outside in an unmarked vehicle, keeping an eye out for any signs of activity. Hours passed, and they were just about to head back when Cooper let out a low growl. Jack squinted into the shadows and spotted a dark figure slinking along the building's wall. He quickly signaled to Chris, and the trio cautiously approached the warehouse. As they neared, Chris decided to take the left side of the building, while Jack and Cooper went right. Shortly after they split up, Cooper let out another quiet growl, and Jack looked up to see 3 men in black hoodies attempting to break into the back door. Drawing his weapon with steady hands, Jack ordered them to freeze and raise their hands. The suspects stopped, and everything seemed to be going smoothly until a sudden shout came from Chris's direction, followed by gunshots echoing in the night air. Another thief had snuck up behind Chris as he'd moved in alone. Just as the rookie turned a corner to join his colleagues, the assailant opened fire and the situation spun out of control. Jack had only a second to call for backup over the radio before he saw a man charging toward him. By the time additional officers arrived, the gang had fled, leaving Cooper locked inside the warehouse while both Jack and Chris lay injured. They were quickly rushed to the hospital, and though their injuries were serious, it was there that the tragic news arrived. Officer Wilson had succumbed to his wounds. Chris, the other officer on the scene, remained in a coma. So everyone is here today. Jack's family arrived in time for the funeral, and Cooper, now under the care of another officer from the precinct, was brought to say his last goodbye to his partner. The service was somber and respectful until, suddenly, Cooper started barking at the casket, a haunting sound that echoed in the silence. Other officers, including Jack Wilson's new canine partner, tried desperately to calm Cooper, but nothing could stop the dog's relentless howling. This heart-wrenching display of loyalty weighed heavily on the family. Despite everyone's efforts, Cooper refused to be comforted, and Jack's new partner was so overwhelmed he collapsed to the ground as the dog once again bolted toward the casket. Reaching his destination, Cooper's bark grew increasingly frantic, and no one knew how to soothe him. A senior officer eventually stood up and addressed the group over the dog's cries. He explained that he'd seen similar behavior in police dogs before. Usually, once they glimpsed their handler's face, they would finally settle. The family was reluctant. None of them had seen Jack's body, and given the distance and timing of his return, they had opted for a closed ceremony. Cooper's agonized cries were piercing, and unwilling to see the loyal dog suffer further, Jack's mother eventually agreed to open the casket. A funeral director stepped forward, and as the lid lifted, a gasp spread through the crowd, the unexpected truth piercing the mourning silence like a knife. Jack's mother gasped in horror. The body within was not her son, Jack Wilson. Everyone stood frozen as she demanded to know the identity of the person lying inside and what had happened to her son. Meanwhile, Cooper finally quieted, lying down beside the grave as if he'd known all along that the casket didn't belong to his partner. Now that he'd drawn attention to the truth, the dog seemed at peace. The funeral was halted as they called the head of the police department and medical examiners. Everyone wanted answers as to how such a grievous mistake could have happened. How had Jack Wilson been declared dead, only for a stranger's body to end up in his casket? Family members and mourners quickly dispersed, following Cooper and the officers to the police station. An investigation was promptly launched. The hospital had mistakenly identified the deceased as Officer Jack Wilson, though no one understood how such a confusion could have occurred. The police chief, Jack's family, Cooper and his new partner arrived at the hospital, all tense and eager for answers. "Are you sure it's Jack?" Jack's mother asked quietly, wringing her hands as she looked to the police chief for some reassurance. "I don't know, ma'am," the chief replied, his voice heavy. "But we'll get to the bottom of this." Meanwhile, the doctor who'd managed the case made his way to the area where the deceased patient's belongings were kept. He carefully retrieved bags labeled with the names of both officers, including the one still in a coma. Their IDs and personal effects had been removed when they arrived, and in the chaos of that night, it seemed no one had verified the IDs in the wallets. As they all stood waiting, The doctor finally returned, setting down the belongings on a table. "Let's check this thoroughly," he said, a note of strain in his voice as he began to sort through the items. As he examined the contents, a sinking feeling grew in the room. The first bag, labeled for the man in a coma, contained the ID of Officer Christopher Collins, whose photo clearly didn't match the man upstairs. "Wait," Cooper said, stepping forward, his voice barely a whisper. That's Chris's ID, but Jack's family had already..." The doctor quickly opened the other bag, labeled for the deceased. With shaking hands, he pulled out the wallet, glancing down at the ID inside. His face went pale as he saw the name. Officer Jack Wilson. The silence was broken only by Jack's mother, who gasped and covered her mouth, horror dawning in her eyes. "Oh my God. They buried him." The doctor looked up at them, his voice cracking as he addressed the group. "I am so sorry. There's been a serious mistake. This is entirely our fault." When the group was led to the hospital director's office, a lengthy and somber conversation followed, filled with repeated apologies as the details of the error emerged. On the night of the warehouse incident, 2 officers had been brought to the hospital from the scene. One had been fatally wounded and passed away during surgery. The second officer, likely defending himself against the attackers, was severely injured and placed in a medically induced coma to aid his recovery. His face was so bandaged due to the deep wounds that no one could recognize him. "No one even checked the IDs?" Cooper asked, his tone carrying equal parts disbelief and anger. The doctor winced. "In the urgency of the moment, and without anyone nearby to identify them, we made a terrible assumption. Jack's family was too far away to come immediately, and we simply took the initial identification at face value." The police chief looked down, shaking his head. "The department had limited resources that night, and we relied on the hospital's word. It's a mistake I deeply regret." Jack's mother began to cry softly, and Cooper reached out, putting a hand on her shoulder. The weight of the mistake settled heavily on everyone in the room. Both families were notified, with Chris's family scheduled to arrive the following day after Jack's funeral. The only one who recognized the mistake was Jack's partner, Cooper. Had it not been for Cooper's insistence on opening the casket, the misunderstanding would have remained undiscovered until the wrong person was buried in Jack's grave. Both families were furious, but after numerous apologies from the hospital and police, an agreement was reached. The funeral was held once again, this time with Officer Christopher Collins laid to rest. A month later, Jack, who had been comatose under Chris's name, woke up. Jack was devastated to learn what Chris's family had endured and expressed his heartfelt condolences to his fallen colleagues' relatives. Jack took another month to fully recover. During this time, Cooper remained by his partner's side. A year later, despite the haunting memories of the warehouse attack, Jack passed his recertification exam to rejoin the force. He returned to active duty alongside Cooper, his loyal partner. To this day, the two remain an inseparable team. Cooper's loyalty reminds us of the profound bond that can form between animals and humans, especially in the face of tragedy. Even though Cooper had lost his first handler and struggled to trust again, he eventually found a steadfast partner in Jack. Cooper's story teaches us about resilience, trust, and the silent, unwavering companionship that animals bring into our lives. Thanks for joining us on this heartfelt journey about Cooper and Officer Jack. It's stories like these that remind us of the incredible loyalty and love animals bring into our lives. If this story moved you, don't forget to hit that like button and share it with someone who could use a reminder of the power of companionship.